Hello everyone and welcome back to my Warhammer 40k guides. I am Brady and today I will be giving you the top 10 armies of July. This top 10 is based off of the armies that placed top 3 the most in ITC Grand Tournament and major events during the month of July. The armies that placed top 3 the most will be higher up on the list, with their final placings being the tiebreaker. So for example, if two armies both had top 3 placings, then whichever army had more first place results will win that tiebreaker. For those wondering where I get this information, it's from my subscription to the Best Coast Pairings app. With that said, not every GT and Major will be used for the placements, only because not every GT and Major from July posted their results, so it's impossible for me to include them in this video. Also, the American Team Tournament will not be considered either, because that is a team tournament and not a singles event and follows a very different format, so I feel like it doesn't make sense to include them on this list. As for deciding which faction in an army is the main faction, whatever detachment or faction has the most points spent on it will be the main army, and everything else in the list is considered allies. So for a quick example, if you have 1500 points of Grey Knights and 500 points of Astro Militarum, then your list is Grey Knights with Astro Militarum allies. So before we get into the content of this video was sponsored by the magnetbaron.com. They sell magnets of all shapes and sizes, they have magnetized flight stands, magnetized model trays, and even offer pre-built and magnetized models, all for a great price. So if you were looking at picking up some magnets for your hobby, then be sure to check out the magnetbaron.com. The link is in the description. So with all of that out of the way, let's get into the content you came here for, and let's discuss the top 10 armies of July. Number 10, Necrons. Necrons are back on this list this month with one placing in July, which came in at second at their event. Unfortunately, this list still revolves around Tesseract vaults, so it seems that this is still the most optimal way to play the army. I eat my words from before when I said it was possible to make a good Necron list without Tesseract vaults, because after much testing, I was not able to come up with a better list myself that didn't include at least one vault. Necrons seem to be in a rough spot right now because of a few reasons. They lack good anti-tank, and at tournaments people know how to properly deal with Necrons in the reanimation protocols, which is to just flat out kill the unit so it can't reanimate. This can be mitigated through tactical play, however, but I assume people haven't figured this out yet, so I'll give you guys the tip here. The trick to keeping your warrior blobs alive is to hide 2 to 4 models in cover where they can't be seen. So even if your opponent targets down the squad, unless they get really lucky with their rolls and you get really unlucky with your saves, it will be impossible for them to kill the last couple of guys that are hiding, which means you can reanimate on the following turn. I think this little trick is relatively unknown, and the main reason why warrior lists aren't doing so well because people are unaware of this. If you use this strategy, I'm not saying you will automatically win games, but it will help you keep your units alive and do what Necrons do best, which is coming back from the dead. Personally, I feel that the army is still at least a tier 2 army, but it's just one of the harder armies to play because it requires a lot of pre-measuring and thinking about how to keep your units alive in order to reanimate. It's not just a paint between the lines type army like some armies, and it requires a little more finesse in order to do well, which is why I don't think we see too many Necrons in the top spots. I think the army is still good, although it could use a couple of little tweaks. It's just more difficult to pilot correctly than other armies. Number 9, Tyranids. The Bugs are back on this list with one placing during the month of July, which was a first place finish at the event that this player participated in. Nids are in a weird place in the meta right now because their biggest counter seems to be doing extremely well, which is the Dark Eldar or Drukhari. This is the main reason for why Nids haven't had a good showing in the last couple of months, or at least why I assume so. There are so many other factors to this, but I think this is the biggest one. The list that placed first was a Kraken Hive fleet and used 3 big units of Gene Stealers, 3 Hive Tyrants, and a bunch of Hive Guard. The Gene Stealers being Kraken for the Ultra Advances, the Hive Guard is Kronos for the rerolls, and the Hive Tyrants as Leviathan. It's a pretty straightforward list and is how I would personally play the Nids if I played the army. I think Nids are still in a great spot, but would be in even better of a spot if their number 1 counter wasn't as popular as they are right now in our current meta. Number 8, Deathguard. The Plaguebringers are back this month on the top 10 list at number 8. Deathguard had one list make top 3 during July, and it was a first place finish. The reason they beat out Nids on the list is because Deathguard has had more placings in the top 10s for 8th edition so far, so that's what I used as a tiebreaker in this case. Getting to the list though, the Deathguard player used a list that is very unique to what we have been seeing in the past. This player took 10 Blightlord Terminators and a Foul Blightspawn, which are units almost never seen in competitive before, at least not at the top tables. This player also opted to bring some Chaos Knight allies with 2 Armigers and a Renegade Knight. This is a very elite list with 0 screening units, as you can see. Overall, I like this list and I'm glad we're seeing new variations of Deathguard and not just more Demon Prince spam. Number 7, Inari. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. A few months ago, the meta was dominated by Inari, and now they barely make the top 10 list this month, with only one placing during July, which was a first place finish, with the tiebreaker being the same as the Deathguard and Nids. Inari was dominating for so long in the top 10 that they deserved the higher spot. Like I mentioned in previous videos, I think Inari is going to continue dropping because the army seems to be becoming less popular over time. Mainly because Craftworld or Drakari or even Harlequin armies seem to be doing better without the Inari, and also because out of all the Eldari races, I think Inari is the hardest to play properly. That's not me saying the other factions are easy to play, it's just that Inari takes some extra thinking in order to make the optimal play, because they have to make the most out of their Soul Burst mechanic, otherwise there was no point in playing them as Inari. Overall, I'm glad Inari is becoming less popular over time, because I think the Soul Burst mechanic isn't too healthy for the game, at least in my opinion, and I never did enjoy playing against it. Number 6. Thousand Suns. The Sons of Magnus fit into this list this month at the 6th spot, with 2 placings that were both second place finishes. I think Thousand Suns are a contender for the best Legion in competitive right now, and the results are still a good argument for this. With the changes to Smite and how the changes don't affect Thousand Suns units, Thousand Suns still get Smite spam and they can still do it extremely well. Most lists I've seen, like the ones you see now, are mainly Demon Prince spam, since they get to cast Smite plus one other ability, and because they hit like a truck in close combat. Demon Princes and Thousand Suns are probably the most points efficient units you can take besides Ahriman on a Disc of Tzeentch. The army is basically a super death ball of a bunch of characters like Demon Princes and Sorcerers surrounded by cheap infantry to protect them because of the character rule. So if played correctly, your opponent won't have anything valuable to shoot or charge for the first few turns, while your characters are all smiting away and getting closer and closer to inevitably charge the enemy and cause some destruction. Overall, I love this list, and I'm actually working on my own competitive Thousand Suns list as we speak. Number 5. Alpha Legion. This month, the Alpha Legion is the top Legion, with 2 top 3 placings during the month of July, with one placement being a second place finish and the other being a first place finish. The first list is a very generic Alpha Legion list, with the Cultist Bomb, a lot of screening cultists, some Obliterators, and some Demon allies. One surprise though is the Chaos Decimator engines, which haven't really been seen much in competitive play, at least on top tables. The other list is a much more soupy list that combines Alpha Legion with Demons and Thousand Suns, with only one Demon Prince in the whole list. Keep in mind though that the second list is only 1500 points because that was the amount that the tournament required. Overall, I think both of these lists are great and I would play either of them, with the first list being the one I would personally play since it seems to fit my playstyle better. Number 4. Craft Worlds. The Eldar are finally getting the representation that I know they deserve, and it makes me happy. I've been saying for a while that the Craft Worlds Codex is one of the better codexes in the game, and now we are finally getting proof of it. They have some of, if not the best psychic spells in the game, and have access to units that cover almost everything needed for a competitive list. Craft Worlds had 2 third place finishes and 1 first place finish overall. As for the lists, I only have 2 of them because one of the players chose to not showcase their list on Best Coast Pairings. So these are the lists I had access to. The first is using a lot of Eldar flyers, which are all amazing because of the way they can move. They're the only flyers in the game that can turn after they end their movement, meaning they can basically do figure 8s in the same spot the whole game if needed. The list also had Dark Eldar allies, since Agent of X stratagem is so good you'd be dumb to not include it in your list. The second list is more of a generic list, using a combination of a Laytok and Ulthway to get the best parts of these 2 factions. They also include a flyer detachment of Dark Eldar to again gain access to the Agents of X stratagem. Overall though, I'm glad Craft Worlds are finally getting the placings that they rightfully deserve. Now before we get into the top 3 armies of July, here are a couple of honorable mentions. Ultramarines. There was one Ultramarine list that placed 3rd at an event using Guilliman with a couple of squads of devs, some rhinos to protect the devs, an ancient that allows the devs to shoot when they die, and also a fire raptor. So even after the points increase, it seems that some people are still getting decent results with them. And Harlequins, who had 1 second place finish, but was not included on the list because of tiebreakers. Their list was basically your bread and butter for Harlequins, which also included Dark Eldar for the Agents of X stratagem, which is allowing me to start making the connection that Dark Eldar is the Astro Militarum of the Eldari races. They are always included in a small detachment because of the one thing that they do better than everyone else. For Astro Militarum, it's their command point battery, and for Dark Eldar, it's for their Agents of X stratagem. Now let's get into the top 3 armies of July. Number 3. Imperial Knights. Last month, there were a number of complaints from people saying that Knights should have been on the list, but the results were there, and Knights never made it into the top 3 of any event. If there was an honorable mentions part in the last video, then I would have mentioned Knights, because they were constantly placing 4th and 5th in a few events, but this wasn't good enough to get them on the list, since the list is only based off of the top 3 placings from each event. This month though, we have 3 second place finishes for the Knights, so now they deserve a spot on this list. And it's a pretty good spot to come in at as well. Knights seem to be very strong, especially against certain armies, but I will stand by my statement that I made in the tier video, where I stated that Knights auto-win some games and auto-lose some games. It really just depends on if the opponent brought enough anti-tank to efficiently deal with them or not. With that said, I think Knights are amazing in the meta right now, because people are all overcompensating for armies like Dark Eldar and bringing tons of anti-infantry, which ends up meaning that they don't have enough anti-tank to actually deal with the Knights. The meta is in a perfect place right now for Knights, and I think we will see them thrive until the meta changes back around and people start including more anti-tank in their lists. I know for me personally, I have completely revamped my Chaos and my Dark Eldar tournament list just because Knights are now insanely popular. Number 2, Drukhari. That's right, the Dark Eldar have been dethroned and are not the top army of July. With 3 placings altogether, 2 being second place finishes and 1 first place finish, the Dark Eldar come in this month at the 2nd spot. For the list, I only have 2 to show because one of the 3 players opted to not post their lists on Best Coast Pairings. So for the list that we can see, it seems that Blackheart is still the go-to faction for the Drukhari, mainly because of the Agents of X stratagem, and also because of the Feel No Pain on their delicate vehicles. The first list is your generic Blackheart battalion, followed by a generic Alatok patrol detachment, then followed by a generic Prophets of Flesh detachment. Homunculus covens are really resilient and make up for the frailness the rest of the Drukhari factions have, and it gives the army a bit more board control since they aren't afraid to get right up in the enemy's face. And the second list is just 1 Blackheart battalion that actually looks like a super fluffy list. It has Ravagers, Venoms, Raiders, Razorwings, and Cabalites, and looks like a very fluffy list that still puts out a decent amount of damage. Personally, I'd optimize the second list a bit more, but it seems to still have been strong enough to do the trick. Overall though, I'm glad Dark Eldar are still doing well since they are one of my favorite armies, but I'm also glad to see that they aren't overly dominant like some people claim. Sure, they are still doing well, but they are along the lines of other tier 1 armies like I've been claiming all along. Number 1, the best army of July is Astro Military. The Imperial Guard are back on top this month, and they take the top spot of July, with 3 placings during July, which include 2 first place finishes and a 3rd place finish. All 3 times it was Catachan armies. I only have access to one of the lists unfortunately, but I'm going to assume the other 2 lists are very similar to the one that I have. The list that I can see is your generic guard list with tons of infantry and mortars with some Forge World Hellhounds, and Blood Angel allies with a couple of Smash Captains or Slamguiniuses, as I've been told in the comments. As for the other 2 lists, they could have possibly incorporated Shield Captain bikes from Custodes, or even Knight allies, or even more Blood Angel allies, or just went full on Catachan. Any of those options are all viable and competitive and stand very well in the current competitive meta. The insane amount of infantry models means stuff like Dark Eldar isn't going to be efficient because of their poison weapons always wounding on a 4+, and the Hellhounds absolutely nuke stuff like Venoms and other flyers, which to be honest, I still find it kind of funny that the counter to flying units is Flamers. Overall though, Guard seems to be back in form and on top where I personally think they belong. They do extremely well against every meta army and rightfully deserve their spot on the top of this list this month. Well anyways, this is going to be it for the video. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more Warhammer 40k content. And if you're already subscribed but would still like to support the channel even further, you can do so on Patreon. The link is in the description. I help all my patrons with stuff like list building and just basic coaching for helping you win games. So if that sounds something that you'd be interested in, then check me out on Patreon. Anyways, thanks for watching the video and I hope you enjoyed it. And I will see you in the next one. Happy wargaming!